I am the newest program director for MRAC and use she, her, ella pronouns. For a visual description, I am a brown Latina woman with black curly hair and a ponytail today, wearing a black long sleeve shirt, sitting in front of a wall that has a variety of local Latinx artists in the Twin Cities. Sam will be dropping a link to a PDF download of the slides from today's presentation if you would like to follow along there. The PDF has been built with accessibility principles, including alt text for images. I will describe any visual elements out loud for this presentation as well. So for example, this slide contains the MRAC logo, which says Metro Regional Arts Council in orange and gray lowercase railway font. Additionally, I will be speaking at a slower pace in consideration for our two ASL interpreters, Kenya and Jason. I'll also be turning my camera off so that the ASL interpreters are the main focus. So for folks who are still trickling in, again, some reminders on some housekeeping items. So please keep your microphone muted for the entirety of the presentation unless asked to unmute. Turn off your video to improve a choppy connection. Today's webinar is going to be recorded and shared online for your reference. And lastly, you can turn on or off live automated captioning using the CC button at the bottom of the screen. Now let's talk about some norms for this virtual meeting. As we go through the presentation, we prefer that you use the chat feature to ask any questions that come up. My colleague Sam and Scott will be keeping tabs on the chat as I present, and we'll be taking pauses throughout the presentation to answer questions that have been asked in the chat. We ask that you focus on asking questions that may be relevant to others in the group. If you have questions that are probably very specific to your situation, please plan to connect with a program director at a later date. And I'll include more information on how to do that later on. It would be extra helpful if you can make your questions something we can track back on. Using the slide title is helpful. So writing something like on the virtual meeting norms slide, can you explain what you meant when you said Sam or Scott would be keeping tabs on the chat? And then lastly, use rename to add pronouns to your name if desired.
Mireya, this is Scott. Sorry to interrupt, but we did have a request for you to have your video on while presenting.
Okay, yes, I can do that. All right, so here's the agenda for today. We'll start by briefly having an overview on MRAC, discussing the application process, then an overview of the Arts Impact for Groups program, a section on application content, lastly, submitting applications and receiving awards, and then I'll also have another space for us to ask any additional questions or have anything clarified. I do anticipate that today's workshop will last the full 90 minutes we've reserved, and we'll take a quick break at about the midpoint. We're packing a lot of information into a short period of time. So I encourage everyone to use the webinar recording on YouTube as an ongoing resource throughout the application process. Once uploaded to YouTube, there's an option to watch the video at a lower rate if that helps you better absorb the information, or speed it up if you like the high-pitched chipmunk voice. Additionally, the subtitles on YouTube can be changed to various languages, and either Sam or Scott, they will be providing step-by-step instructions on how to do that in the chat. This slide has a collection of small headshots of each staff member. 7 women and 1 man of varying racial backgrounds, all smiling. The first row is program directors, and they include Masami, Jovan, Scott, and myself, Mireya. The second row has the rest of the team, Kathy, Becky, Sam, and Young. Sam and Scott are on this call as well as some other MRAC staff. And Scott are providing technical support, and again, they're monitoring the chat to answer questions. All right, so I'm going to start by giving a quick overview of the state arts funding system and how MRAC fits into it. So thanks to taxpayers in Minnesota who generate funding, the Minnesota legislature decides how funds for the arts are available through the appropriation within the usual budget processes, and a special fund as part of the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment, which the logo is to the left. The Legacy Amendment was an amendment to the state constitution passed by voters of Minnesota that increased sales tax by 0.3% for 25 years. 19.75% of that legacy fund goes to the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And below that, state arts dollars go to the Minnesota State Arts Board, and their logo's to the right, and they are a state agency. This slide is a continuation of the state arts funding system. The Minnesota State Arts Board uses 70% of those available state arts dollars for their own funding programs. You may be eligible for opportunities at the Minnesota State Arts Board, so please be sure to check out for opportunities there. The remaining 30% of state arts dollars are distributed through 11 regional arts councils, of which MRAC is one. In our previous fiscal year 2021, MRAC distributed about $4.3 million into community. So here we have a slide titled MRAC Region 11. On the left of the map, or on the left is a map of Minnesota split up into 11 geographic regions. And then highlighted on the right is Region 11, Twin Cities Metro, with counties Carver, Hennepin, Anoka, Ramsey, Washington, Dakota, and State, with areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul also delineated. I would also like to acknowledge that this region serves as a traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. The MRAC region makes up about half of the population of the state, and we receive about 40% of the funding distributed among the regional arts councils. On this slide, we have MRAC's mission. So the Metropolitan Arts Council improves arts access for communities in the 7-county metropolitan area through support to artists and organizations. We are a nonprofit, not a state agency, despite the fact that our funding comes mostly from state sources. But because of that funding, it's vital that all of these art projects serve communities. On this slide, we have 2 of MRAC's grant programs specifically for groups. The first one is Flexible Support Grant, which is up to $15,000 to support projects and programs led by groups and organizations creating access to the arts. Arts Impact for Groups, the program that we're all here to learn about today, is up to $10,000 to BIPOC, disability, and/or LGBTQIA2+ led groups for projects and programs creating access to the arts. In all instances, groups must have their primary address in the MRAC region, which we discussed previously, and we'll talk a little bit more later too. On this slide, there are 2 MRAC grant programs for individuals. The first one is Next Step Fund, and that's up to $5,000 for the growth and stability of individual artists. This program is funded by the McKnight Foundation. The second program, unfortunately, the deadline has already passed, but we did have it. It's the Arts Impact for Individuals. It's $5,000, and it was also a program that went for BIPOC, disabled, and or LGBTQIA2+ led, or individuals that identify with those communities, to create access to the arts for communities and or engage with communities through creative endeavors. Again, in all instances, the applicants must reside in the MRAC region. All right, so this is our first question section. On the right of the slide, there's a large white question mark in a black circle. And if anyone has any questions about MRAC staff, state arts funding, MRAC's mission or region, MRAC grant programs.
This is Scott. There's nothing in the chat so far, but I will speak slowly so people can add in any questions if they have any. And if not, we can probably keep going.
Okay, then we will keep going. So if you need to contact someone during the application process, we ask that you reach out based on the type of assistance you need. So for questions about the general MRAC grant making process and technical assistance, like trouble logging into your account, please reach out to our general lines at mrac@mrac.org, or our phone number, which is 651-645-0402. I'll also go back and spell out our email address. So that's mrac@mrac.org. For quick questions about eligibility and the application process, I am the contact, which means I'm the first point of contact if there are quick questions. My email address is mireya@mrac.org, or mirella@mrac.org. You can also reach me at my phone number, which is 651-523-6380. For quick questions about eligibility and the application process, sorry about that. For more complex questions or extended assistance, please fill out the application assistance meeting request form under help with your application. This form is live now, so if you would like to request a meeting, you can go ahead and do that at mrac.org/grants/impact/groups. We are all working together on programs, so as you go through the application process, you might be hearing from anyone on the MRAC staff. We get lots and lots of questions, but we're seriously happy to help out. And to help us help you, please do your best to read the guidelines thoroughly before reaching out with questions. This slide is titled Application Process with a simple flowchart showing the application process as green arrows moving from one step to the next. The process starts with applicant/MRAC staff, where MRAC staff help with applications through grant information webinars like this one, or provide individualized support. Applicants must submit their application through our grant interface by the deadline. And then staff check in applications, meaning we begin reviewing for eligibility. Next, moving to the right-hand column, applications from eligible groups will be reviewed by a group of peer panelists who individually score proposals. Panelists are trained on the grant guidelines and provided with a guide to help them rate each application on the grant criteria. Once comments and ratings from panelists are collected, MRAC staff sends the results to the MRAC board. Grant funds will be allocated based on panel rankings and available funds. MRAC staff submits application rankings to the MRAC board of directors who make the final decisions on funding. On this slide on the left, there is an image of the International Disability Symbol, a person using a wheelchair. MRAC requests that all applicants apply online unless the disability prevents them from doing so. Contact us to begin a conversation about how to make sure you can have an equal opportunity to apply. Guidelines are available online for screen reader software and translation programs. We can provide them in other formats as well. Solutions we have previously implemented include filling out an adapted form in Microsoft Word and providing verbal responses that MRAC will share via audio recording or transcribe. This year, we are also accepting Spanish written and verbal applications and providing guidelines in Spanish. So again, to begin a conversation about how we can help, please contact MRAC staff. This slide is titled Before Applying, Resources. On the right, there's a screenshot of the grant resource page on the MRAC website with the green arrow pointing to the resources tab. Some online resources that we provide include templates, technical how-tos for the grant interface, links to sites to find demographic information, and glossary of terms. This slide is a continuation on resources that we provide. So program directors are available to assist with your application. If you have a brief question, reach out to me. Remember, you might hear back from anyone on staff. If you have a more extensive question or need help that will require more than a couple sentences, you should fill out the meeting request form that is found on the Arts Impact for Groups program page of our website. And this is mrac.org/grants/IMPACT/GROUPS. So in a meeting with us, there are two types of meetings available. The first is group eligibility/project idea development. And the second is application eligibility review. So we'll do some initial refining and framing of ideas with you, and we'll review application materials for eligibility and completeness, but we are not able to help with reviewing content beyond eligibility. On this slide, there's a big red exclamation point with a red circle around it, indicating our first important disclaimer. Everything discussed today is in the guidelines, but we do not have the time to recount everything that is in the guidelines during this webinar. So please read the guidelines. Whether in Spanish or English, please read them. They're there and have a wealth of information. That said, it's our job as program directors to be the experts in these guidelines. So please ask us questions. Again, on this slide, we have a red exclamation point with a red circle around it, signifying the second important disclaimer. Many applicants have been coming to MRAC for years, and they often just need a refresher on what's new each year. Arts Impact for Groups is a brand new grant program at MRAC. So to do your best, come to this program with fresh eyes. Don't assume anything based on what happened in the past. Even if you're a veteran MRAC applicant, we are here to help navigate. Here we have the Arts Impact for Groups timeline. For this year, MRAC, we have our fiscal year. We have a new grant program titled Arts Impact for Groups, for which the application deadline is Monday, February 7th, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. Award notifications will go out on May 18th, 2022, and the eligible funding period start then and has June 30th, 2023 as the latest eligible proposal end date. So after the deadline hits, we begin reviewing all of the applications for eligibility. Please review the guidelines carefully. Staff can deem parts of your application or the entire application ineligible. Also pay attention to your email. We may contact you at any point after the deadline seeking necessary information, so keep an eye on it regularly. Applicant email will be the only way we reach out to you. We will give quick deadlines, and it's important to respond in a timely manner. No response could mean that your application becomes ineligible or that you lose out on an award. This slide is titled Geographic Eligibility. To the left, there's a map of MRAC's geographic region. Again, in all cases, a group must have its primary address located in Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, or Washington County. In addition to geographic eligibility, arts impact for groups has a leadership identity eligibility. At least 51% of leadership staff must identify as Black, Indigenous, and/or people of color, BIPOC, and/or people with disabilities, PWD, and/or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, agender, two-spirited, LGBTQIA2+. You will be asked questions about your leadership's identity. For more information, please review the group information data section in the Arts Impact for Groups guidelines, which now also has examples. Now we're going to discuss the type of eligible groups, of which there are 4. So the first and second are here on this slide. The first is arts groups and organizations. So federally tax exempt 501c3 nonprofit arts organizations with annual operating expenses of $400,000 or less. The second are cultural groups and organizations. So they're also federally tax exempt 501c3 culturally specific nonprofit organizations that provide arts and non-arts programming with annual arts programming expenses $1,000 or less. The third group that's eligible for this grant would be someone who's fiscally sponsored, or a group that's fiscally sponsored with arts projects. A fiscal sponsor is a tax-exempt nonprofit organization that receives MRAC grant monies and manages the financial aspects of the project on behalf of a group that does not have tax-exempt status. Fiscal sponsors must be registered with the IRS as a federally tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit with a Minnesota address and have an active registration with the Minnesota Secretary of State as a nonprofit organization. Groups that are fiscally sponsored must have operating expenses of $400,000 or less and have at least 3 people in leadership, as well as have an eligible fiscal sponsor at the time of application. MRAC does require a fiscal sponsor agreement letter to confirm that your organization/group has an active working relationship with the fiscal sponsor at the time of the application. If you are a fiscal sponsored group, you will be required to upload a letter or email from the fiscal sponsor. The guidelines outline the specific things that must appear in the letter or email, but we also have fiscal sponsor letter templates on the research page of our website and on the Arts Impact for Groups program page. These templates have also been translated to Spanish. The last type of eligible groups are here on the slide, and they are non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations. And these are federally tax exempt 501c3 nonprofit organizations with annual arts programming expenses of $400,000 or less. Non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations must be able to isolate their arts programming expenses from non-arts and non-cultural financial activity. Public entities, such as a unit of state, local, or tribal government with annual arts expenses of $400,000 or less, again, the public entity must be able to isolate their arts expenses from non-arts and non-cultural financial activity. And lastly, community education units of a school district with annual arts budgets of any size. Community education units must be able to isolate their arts programming expenses from non-arts and non-cultural financial activity. All right, so now on this slide, there are 5 examples of ineligible groups. And so the first is any organization or group whose leadership staff is not comprised of at least 51% BIPOC, PWD, and or LGBTQIA2+. The second would be if they're located outside of Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, or Washington County. Individuals are ineligible. This is a groups grant program. Public, alternative, charter, transitional, or home schools. And lastly, organizations whose main purpose is to raise funds for another person, organization, or cause. An extra note on the schools, or number 4, this does include school support organizations such as PTAs, PTOs, school foundations, etc. Schools or groups / organizations providing K-12 education that meet state education requirements and post-secondary education leading to a degree or accreditation are all ineligible. Next up, I'm going to have a bunch of slides about ineligible project activities and expenses. These slides have big red X's in them to reinforce all the super not fun rules that we have to enforce as we read your applications. So even though these slides aren't the most fun, I thought I'd share the cute way Scott, one of our amazing program directors, attempted to make this a little more tolerable. In this first slide, there's a pretty straightforward red X made up of 2 equally thin and precise strokes with round. The following projects and expenses are ineligible. If projects or programs are not legally compliant, so not upholding laws, attempting to influence legislation, essentially for religious socialization of participants or audience, or discriminate against persons or groups. If activity happens outside of Minnesota. So activities that occur outside the state of Minnesota are ineligible. Travel expenses to or from Minnesota are ineligible, but you can engage an out-of-state artist or consultant. Just don't include travel expenses to or from Minnesota. Costs for relocating an address out of Minnesota are also ineligible. So on this slide, it's a little bit more on ineligible projects and expenses. And this red X is a bit more casual, slant, and rendered in broad strokes like it was made by a paintbrush. So projects and expenses outside of the eligible funding period are ineligible. This point is really important because it's where we see the most issues in applications. When an applicant gets these wrong, they often have their grant amount reduced or their entire application becomes ineligible. So please pay close attention to this. MRAC grants be used for reimbursement. All expenses included in a grant proposal must be incurred within the eligible funding period listed for each grant round. Incurred expenses are those that are confirmed debts and or firm promises to pay, whether or not cash has changed hands. Performing artist fees, for example, would be an incurred expense at the time a contract is signed, even if payment. This slide has more on, so the proposal start date you enter in an application is the date on which you will begin incurring expenses for your project. For arts impact for must be on or after May 18th, 2022. The latest proposal end date is June 30th, 2023. And now the X on this slide brings us back to a formal composition. It is thick with squared off ends in a severe, almost militaristic quality. Turned on its side, it would be the logo for the Red Cross. But in this position, it just tells us an unequivocal no. The red X on this slide sort of builds on the last one. That same severe blacky X can now contained within a thinner red circle. It tells us not only no, but specifically not this. Here are some less situations for ineligible project activities that are also really important. Managed by another entity other than the applicant. Raise funds or regrant or donate funds to another entity. Substituting other state dollars. Arts education projects review this closely in the guidelines. Capital projects, facility improvements and equipment purchases to lease spaces that are not approved by the property owner. No capital will be made to residential properties. Now to get into some specific ineligible budget items. But first, we have another X. And this one really changes it up. Instead of a red X on a white background, it's a white X on a red circular background. Unrealized income, so such as scholarships or in-kind, purchase of real estate property, purchase of alcoholic beverages, or to pay associated costs, development of endowments, debt reduction, and building cash reserves. The second and third bullet point, there's specific distinctions. So arts groups and organizations and fiscally sponsored groups with arts projects can request capital. Cultural groups and organizations, non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit organizations, public entities, and community education units can request up to 50% of the amount requested from MRAC for capital expenses. So other eligible groups that are not arts groups or organizations or fiscally sponsored groups with arts projects can only request up to 50% of the amount requested. Otherwise, that would be ineligible. So for example, if a non-arts and non-cultural nonprofit requests $10,000 from Arts Impact for groups, then $5,000 could be for capital expenses, or up to $5,000. All right, so I have just 2 more slides before we take another break for questions and then a regular 5-minute break. The red X on this slide is made up of 2 thin pencil-like strokes. Other than timeline issues, the rule I'll describe next is the most frequent point where we see issues. So again, please pay close attention. Expenses included in another MRAC grant are ineligible. So these would be already covered by another MRAC grant, or you've already requested it in another pending MRAC application. If you include a given expense in your project budgets, you may not include the same expense in any other grant proposal you submit to MRAC. This slide is specific to those of you who have active MRAC grants and those of you who have pending application. So if you've previously applied, so prior to fiscal year 21, you'd be eligible. If you've applied to the fiscal year 21 equity response grant, again, eligible. The fiscal year 21 flexible support grant, you would maybe be eligible. I highly encourage you to refer to the already have another MRAC grant awards section of the guidelines, as well as project changes page on MRAC websites under grants, under the grants tab. And then the fiscal year 2022 flexible support grant or a pending application, again, you might be eligible. But in all cases, if there are project expenses from these other grants and applications, they cannot appear on your new arts impact for groups grant application. So now finishing off the red X's with my favorite, a woodblock like serif font made up of horizontal lines with heavier lines on the left side and lighter lines on the right side. It's vaguely the IBM logo, but with a hint of old-timey circus poster thanks to a drop shadow. And now I hope you've enjoyed taking this red X tour with me. We are now going into our questions.
All right, this is Scott. We had some good questions come in. The first was just a clarification what PWD means, which appears in this presentation a few times, and that means people with disabilities. There was also a question about, just lost it, fiscally sponsored groups. When you say that fiscally sponsored groups must have 3 people in leadership, could some of those be on the fiscally sponsored groups board?
So for the fiscally sponsored, the 3 leaders would be a part of the arts creating group. And maybe I'm not fully understanding that question.
Yeah, I sort of said it kind of strange too. Emily, I believe your question is, can the leadership of the group, as you put it into the application, can that include people who are working on the project and the like advisory board, if you have that? And the answer is yes, that you'd want to include the people who are making decisions and are in leadership of the project, which should include the people working on the project in some sort of senior or significant role, and then any advisory board, board of directors, things like that.
And there is a leadership section in the guidelines that I would highly encourage you to take a look at, which provides a definition for that.
There's another question: are groups that are not fiscally sponsored by another organization eligible to receive funding in this program? And I just responded quickly that groups will need to have a fiscal sponsor relationship established at the time of application to be eligible in this program.
If
and then we had,
sorry, I would just add that if 501c3. So if they're not, then yes, they do need a fiscal sponsor.
Great. And then lastly, and there might have been more that came, can you give some examples of capital expenses? And I again answered in the chat that capital expenses are generally facility improvements and large or expensive equipment expected to be useful beyond a year.
Thank you, Scott.
Another question, can we get a copy of the slides? And it looks like somebody else, being so helpful, shared that link in there. And then there was a clarification. Oh, sorry, that question was answered. Another question, do the 3 leaders of the fiscally sponsored group need to all be paid staff? So do the 3 leaders of the fiscally sponsored group need to be paid staff?
I don't believe so, but Scott, over to you on that one.
No, that nobody needs to be paid. We love when people are paid, but it's not like a requirement. And then another question, I am an S corporation, on disability, woman of color, and no brick and mortar. I work from home. Am I available for the grant?
for the, again, I'm not a tax expert at all by any means. So for an S corporation, they would still need a fiscal sponsor because you're not a 501c3. But maybe
Right,
we
I
need to,
would agree with that.
need to have like further conversation. Be more than happy to sit down and talk about that a little bit more. But again, not a tax expert.
And those are all the questions that I see in the chat right now.
Well, thank you. We will take a 5 now. It's 3:45. Come back at 3:50. All right, so we will be resuming in just a few seconds. I hope y'all were able to stretch, get some water. We're halfway there. Okay. So now we're going to get into the specifics of arts impact for groups. So the program purpose is to provide up to $10,000 in funding to help groups create access to the arts and stay connected to audiences / community in Minnesota. Here, there are 3 colored circles that lie next to each other with text in each, all encased in an orange rectangle labeled increasing a community's access to the arts. The blue circle says organizational capacity. The red circle says arts programming. And lastly, the yellow circle says operations. The Arts Impact for Groups program is designed to be an infusion of funds to support a group's ability to create access to the arts. We present these 3 major buckets to spark your thinking. Your group gets to define which activities it will do, and we call this your project. Project means a collection of activities that are described in this application. So any of the types of activities appearing in these circles independently or in some combination could be the organization's or group's project or program. We understand that each of these components is critical to a healthy arts ecosystem, and we're asking you to identify those activities that will help you do your work. What's also important is figuring out the project that is the right fit to make an impact on your community's access to the arts, and demonstrating that you have an effective plan to get there. Serving more people doesn't automatically make it a better project. So focus on doing what you do best. Keep in mind the maximum request is $10,000, and projects that are appropriately scaled to the $10,000 grant will fare better in the program. If you have a big project, consider what parts of that project you focus on as the project in your application. And again, these 3 components are not required. You don't have to do all 3. You decide. This is more so just spark some ideas. Now, we use the word project a lot. So I'm going to repeat our definition of the word. For MRAC, the project means the collection of activities that are described in this application. So your project then could be a first-time event or activity the group has never produced before that falls within the eligible funding period. A recurring annual or seasonal event it has produced before that falls again within the eligible funding period. Or the portions of an ongoing program that clearly fall within the eligible funding period, and or an activity supporting the organizational capacity and or operations of the group. So for example, equipment purchases, management projects, or personnel expenses during the eligible funding period. Your project could be a combination of any of these things too, like funding a dance class, paying your bookkeeper, and buying a new sound system. All of these separate activities together would be considered one project. All right, so here we have another question section about purpose and projects. There's a white question mark and a black circle. Are there any questions?
This is Scott. There aren't any additional questions in the chat right now, but I'll just pause for a moment if you want to type any in. I don't see any more, but again, everyone, feel free to type them in at any time. We can answer any questions about anything at some point later in the webinar.
All right. Here, there's a green icon of a human eye. So all the information in these sections will be made available to panelists. So this is where we want you to focus your energy because they will be part of the review. The components are group's purpose, project/program name and description, project/program, community, proposal budgets, and then the fiscal sponsor name, and that's there to determine if there are any conflict of interest. On this slide, there is a green eye, but with a black line through it. These components of the application are not seen by the panel. So remember, because none of this will be seen by the panel, it won't be part of their review. It's important to pay attention to these fields and answer them honestly, but the panelists won't know any details about those fields unless you also include it in the narrative somewhere. So the components that aren't visible to panelists: start and end dates, outcomes proposed, evaluation plan, the fiscal sponsor letter/email, and then lots and lots of data for reporting for both organization/group and the specific project. And regarding the data, most of it is because of the state. They require it. Some does help us better serve our region. And for the leadership data section, that will help us determine eligibility. On this slide, there are a few application tips. You will type your application into the text boxes online. Character counts include letters, numbers, spaces, and paragraph breaks, but there is no formatting. So that's like bold or italics. Do not include links in the narrative text fields. We'll remove those. The application system will auto-save your work for every few minutes, but some applicants may wish to work in another document and paste your answers in once written. Application templates are available as downloadable Word documents on our webpage. The narrative is your primary tool for panelists to learn about your group and its work. I've included the components of the narrative here. So that is group purpose, which has 1,500 characters max. Project/program name, 100 characters max. Project/program description, 200 characters max. Project or program, that's 3,000 characters max. The community section, 3,000 characters max. And then proposal budgets, 1,000 characters max for each income and expenses. You should write as if the reader doesn't know anything about your group, your community, or your arts discipline. In general, the more specific and tangible a proposal reads, the better it does with panel ratings. Help panelists picture exactly what you will do. I'll note that the character limit is the maximum characters. You do not need to fill that entire text box if you don't need it. But I encourage you to make sure you have fully answered each question posed, and I will provide those questions in the next slide. But for some groups, especially younger groups or those with very simple projects, you may not need to use all of that space, and that's okay, as long as panelists can get the information they need to make a decision. Group purpose. This section has 1,500 characters max. We highly encourage you to consider numbering your responses. The first question is, what are the group's goals or intentions related to your artistic practice and or work in the community? The second question, in general, what kind of arts programming does your group plan to produce or has it produced? So this section really helps introduce your group to panelists who may not be familiar with what you do or your group's artistic output. The project/program name has 100 characters max. So here in a few words, what is the name or title of your project or program? The project/program description has 200 characters max. Here you'll provide a very brief, like 1 to 2 sentence summary of your project, beginning with the phrase funding to or funding for. If it doesn't start like that, we might edit to make sure it has that format. The project or program. This section has 3,000 characters max, and you can consider, again, please consider numbering your responses. So the first question, describe the project or program for which the group seeks funding. Second, What are the goals of this project or program? Third, in what ways does this project or program align with or advance the group's goals? And lastly, the fourth question, what are the activities that will take place during the grant period? Where will the activities take place? Describe the major activities or tasks that take place between the start and end dates of your project or program. The community section has 3,000 characters max. Again, please consider numbering your responses. The first question under community is describe the people your project or program benefits and how these people are aligned with the group. Second question, describe the connection between this project or program and how it will benefit the people previously described in question 1. And lastly, the third question, who are the people working on the project or program? Describe their roles within the project or program. How are they aligned to the project or program goals? Next, we'll talk about project budgets. Picture of the financial aspects of the project, especially how you plan to spend the money. So budgets are where we see the most issues. What I will present now is an overview, but in the guidelines, there's a lot of guidance that will help you avoid issues and also examples. In-kind items, scholarships, and ineligible expenses should obviously not be included. Keep in mind, budgets must match, meaning your total expenses and total income must be the same number, income equals expenses. Staff will tabulate, so double check all math. And the sample budgets I mentioned and checklists in the guidelines, the examples include if MRAC is the only funding source for the project or program, and also if MRAC is one of multiple funding sources. All right, so the project budget expenses, aka your spending plan. This section has 1,000 characters, and you'll list the major expenses of your proposal with dollar amounts and short descriptions. Again, do not include in-kind expenses or any other ineligible expenses. Your project may be larger than the amount requested in this grant program. Sum of all items listed in this section will be the total project cash expenses. This is a continuation on the total project budget expenses. I listed here some examples of eligible expenses, which include contracted artists, administrative and other personnel, professional fees, consultants, supplies and/or capital purchases, space rental and/or equipment rental, accessibility related costs, please be specific, facilities expenses, administrative overhead, again, be specific. Please carefully review project eligibility and ineligibility projects and ineligible expenses sections of the guidelines, including ineligible expenses that may affect MRAC award/eligibility. And now project income budget, which also has 1,000 characters. Here you'll list major cash income sources with dollar amounts and short descriptions. So there are 2 examples here. The first one is if MRAC is the only funding source for the project or program, you'll list the amount you're requesting and then state MRAC Arts Impact for Groups grant. The second example is if MRAC is one of multiple funding sources for the project or program, you'll still list your request, MRAC Arts Impact Groups grant, and then below additional sources of income. If your total project cash expenses are equal to the amount requested, again, just enter MRAC. But if your expenses are larger than what you're requesting from Arts Impact for Groups, then please outline how you will cover those expenses. Here on this slide, there are examples of other sources of income. And that includes ticket sales, admission fees, tuition fees, pay for live stream, membership dues, rental fees, individual donations, other grant sponsorships. A note here that the income budget must exactly match the expense budget. Again, income equals expenses. This slide is titled Review Criteria. And criteria are the lens through which panelists are asked to focus the review of your application. You can download the panel rating guide on the Arts Impact for Groups program page, which outlines the rating scale that will be used to review your application. This may be a useful tool for you as you craft your application. MRAC believes that stronger applications demonstrate a group has clear goals, an effective project design, and the necessary relationships to make the work meaningful to community. Therefore, the review criteria are group and project goals, project design, and relationships. A highly rated application will clearly demonstrate how each criterion informs and aligns with the other two criteria. On the slide, there's an image on the right, a circle split into 3 equal sections with arrows pointing in both directions between each section. Again, the sections are group, project, and goals, project design, and relationships. The panel will apply all 3 criteria to the application as a whole. So for example, there might be information in your budget that supports the strength of the project design criterion. On this slide, there is a 1 through 5 rating scale along a horizontal orange arrow indicating a spectrum. Panelists will review all applications online through the grant portal and individually score each proposal assigned to them. Panelists will rate each criterion from 1 to 5, where 5 is the top score. Panelists are asked to use the full scale as they rate applications. Criteria ratings are combined for a total application score of 3 to 15. Scores are then averaged across panelists for a final rating. So we ask panelists to think about their scoring like this. At the top of the scale, a 5, the criterion is addressed with robust specificity and intention, clear alignment with other criteria. Now at the bottom of the scale, a 1, the criterion is not addressed or is significantly misaligned with other criteria. And then in the middle, a 3, the criterion is addressed vaguely or generically, and there is an unclear or questionable alignment with other criteria. So that means that a 2 is somewhere between the bottom and middle, and a 4 is somewhere between the middle and the top. Panelists will be required to write at least 1 comment about their feedback and reasoning for their ratings. We specifically direct panelists to look for the content of the application, not how eloquently the words are written. This is an important equity issue, as applicants should not be scored lower because English is a learned language or because they have a reading disorder like dyslexia. You may find it helpful to get a friend or a colleague who is less familiar with your organization or project to review your application with the rating guide available for download on the Arts Impact for Groups grant program page. So now we'll go through the 3 criterion and the specific questions or information under each of those. On this slide, there's a rating scale with the orange arrow on the left. So for groups and project goals, to what extent do you agree with the following? Applicant has described specific goals/intentions overall that create or contribute to the group's capacity to create access to the arts. Applicant's vision for how it produces arts activities is relevant to the interests/needs of the community it is intended to benefit. Applicant has made a compelling case for why the proposed project aligns with or advances the group's goals or intentions. On this slide for project design, again, there's a rating scale with an orange arrow on the left. And so for the project design, to what extent do you agree with the following? The project details are thoroughly considered. The scope is appropriate. Activities will effectively produce the intended outcomes for the group. The project's design will create or contribute to the group's capacity to create meaningful access to the arts that is inclusive and accessible to community members marginalized because of race, disability, and other kinds of oppression. And lastly, relationships. The rating scale, again, here is on the left, it's an orange arrow. And for relationships, to what extent do you agree with the following? Applicant has clearly defined a community or communities that will benefit from the project or program, who is in this community, who is served in or by this community. The project described is specifically designed to benefit this community and has well-defined methods of reaching intended community members and meeting their needs. Applicant has demonstrated that people working on the project authentically reflect and are positioned to serve this community. I do want to talk a little bit about the leadership section of the application. Again, this isn't shared to panelists. However, the information is used to determine group eligibility. The first field, called leadership, asks you to list individuals who lead your group by first and last name, separated by commas with their expertise, profession, or organizational affiliation. Do not list bios in this section. I provided an example here, and it's also available in the guidelines. So the example is Mireya Espino, comma, community organizer, comma, treasurer. To MRAC, group leaders are defined as the people who are in positions of power. Include core decision makers of the group's overall operations, and this must include all board members and executive director or equivalent positions. If applicable, include an advisory committee. Fiscally sponsored groups should not include the staff or board members of the group's fiscal sponsor, but should include core decision makers of its own group's activities, including an advisory committee if applicable. So please refer to the group information and data section in the Arts Impact for Groups guidelines for more information and examples on eligible and ineligible groups. This slide is a continuation on leadership. Individuals named on this list must know that they are part of the leadership team of the applicant and know this proposal is being submitted. Their names will be shared with the Minnesota State Arts Board. A minimum of 3 individuals must be listed as part of the leadership team. If you list less than 3 people, your application will be ineligible. A series of leadership identities questions ask you to tell us about the identities of those same people you've just listed in the leadership field. This information is gathered to determine eligibility, so please pay close attention to this section. You may choose not to disclose this information by answering 0 or prefer not disclose /unknown. However, if we do not have enough information to determine that the applicant group is at least 51% BIPOC, PWD, and or LGBTQIA2+, the application will be deemed ineligible. This information is shared in aggregate, meaning all the numbers from applicants are added without associating identities, and shared with the MRAC Board of Directors to track distribution of funds. Please do reach out to us if you're struggling with this section. We know it can be challenging, and we do want to help you get this right. The information submitted in the leadership identity section will not be provided to panelists, again, as part of the review of your application. All right, so another question section. Are there any questions in the chat?
This is Scott. We had a question about, would social media advertising be an eligible expense? And I answered that yes, marketing expenses like social media advertising are eligible. And then there was another question about, and I will say I also answered this in the chat. I've been busy there. Somebody asked, is a first time or annual fundraiser event to raise money to sustain a nonprofit organization an eligible project? Expenses like venue rental, artist contractors, meals. Would the flexible support program be more fitting for something like that? And my response was that generally, activities that are eligible in arts impact for groups are also eligible in flexible support. The focus of your activity should be to provide arts access, not simply raise funds for your organization. Although, of course, it could also raise funds for your organization, but that's a nuanced conversation. So I suggested connecting with a program director to discuss your idea further. And I don't have any more questions in the chat, I believe.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering those. And then we will move on to the next section, which is submitting your application. This is the last section of the presentation, so we're almost done. All applications must be submitted online by 11:59 p.m. on the deadline date, which is February 7th, 2022 for arts impact groups. Now, if you don't have access to a computer or internet, contact us well before the deadline. Staff technical assistance is available until 5 p.m. on February 7th or deadline day. And then please have an active email address that you check often. Official communication all happens through email. And we may contact you at any point between submission and the final decisions. All right, so then this slide is the MRAC grant interface, and on the right is a screenshot of the homepage at mrac.org. There are 3 yellow buttons with a green arrow pointing to the bottom labeled Manage Your Organizational Grant. Use one account per organization, but you can add multiple contacts in that same organization once you log on. Your login ID is your email address, not the organization name. And then you can reset your password, and staff were more than willing to help with that. All right, so now if you receive an award, this is the second to last slide. So if you do receive an award, please sign the grant agreement and upload a W-9 dated within this fiscal year, which would be July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. The check is issued to groups or their fiscal sponsor's address. Please acknowledge, grantees need to use the appropriate language and logos on all promotion of funded activities. Language and images of this are available on our website. Please communicate project changes ahead of time and then submit your final report. On this slide, there's an image with fireworks with green, red, blue, and yellow lights to illustrate the excitement of receiving an MRAC award. All right, so in a moment, I'll take any additional questions, but again, I do want to just highlight a couple of spots on our website that will be the most valuable to you. So the first is the grant program page, mrac.org/arts impact groups, which also has the Google form to request a meeting. And you can also click on the links in the PDF, and it is now open And then on MRAC's general grants page, we have a new resource that is a comprehensive intro to everything about MRAC, the application process, suggestions on how to start and finish strong with an application, and how to get more help. There's also detailed information about other grant programs we'll be offering this fiscal year. So Scott, any questions?
This is Scott. No further questions I'm seeing, although somebody is very excited about this grant program, which
That's
we
great
share.
to hear. I will then stop sharing so we can all see each other. And I can stay on till 4:30. So that was the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for attending. This video or recording will be available on YouTube by the end of this week with captioning. And again, if you do need step-by-step instructions on how to change the subtitles to a different language, we have that for you. If you have any issues finding that, feel free to reach out.